Okay, so we're going to be starting in Esther chapter 7 today. And, the Bible tells us that God has His hand in the affairs of people. Psalm 75 says this, Psalm 75 verses 6 and 7 says, "For not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the desert comes exaltation, but God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another." And, we've been watching, as we go through the book of Esther, we've been watching Haman, as he's sort of promoting himself. We've been watching that in these chapters, these recent chapters. But today we're going to see how God intervenes in all that. And we're going to see how God decides who He's going to promote. We're going to see that in our study today. And so the first point I have in my outline is that there's a time of reckoning where God puts one down, just like it said in Psalm 75, a time of reckoning. Haman, who is the villain of the book of Esther, we've been looking at a lot lately, he has been enjoying what he thinks is his great honor, as he feels like he's just going up and up and up. In society, he's been invited to dine with the king and the queen now 2 times. We're going to see the second time coming up here in a minute when we read from the chapter. And we saw his pride last time. We talked about his pride problem and just how greatly he thinks of himself. But there was this ominous warning from his wife and friends there in chapter 6, verse 13, sort of the end of the verse there, says, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." And so now, after that ominous sort of warning, he goes immediately to dine with the king and queen again. And that's where we pick up in chapter 7. Look at verse 1, Esther chapter 7, verse 1. It says, "Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, 'What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done.' Then Queen Esther replied, 'If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed and to be annihilated. Now if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king.' Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, 'Who is he and where is he? Who would presume to do thus?' Esther said, 'A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman.' Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king." And so, Esther then finally makes her request. It's interesting that Esther waited an extra day to make her request. They'd had a banquet the day before, but all she said then was, "Well, meet me again tomorrow," right? She didn't give what her actual request was. And we wonder, did she have kind of some cold feet here? Was she a little bit gun shy? Was she trying to sort of create suspense, to let things build up here to this big question? But I think actually, no matter what was going on in her mind, there was a providential reason for that. We talked about that last time as we looked at the pride of Haman, that God intended to humble Haman in all this. He wanted to humble him first and really give him a chance. I remember Haman had to parade Mordecai around town, the one that he hated so much, and praise Mordecai. And we talked about last time how that was a chance for Haman to turn away from this wicked plan he had. God gave him a chance to repent of that, that he could see, look, Mordecai is a good guy. He's not a bad guy. I shouldn't be doing this to him and his people. But Haman missed that opportunity. He turned it down. And so Esther makes this request here in chapter 7 for her life and the lives of her people, starting in verse 3. And she does flatter the king a little bit here, that she says, well, if we're just going to be sold into slavery, I wouldn't waste your time. It seems a little odd to us. I think we would all be making that plea no matter what, even in that case. But maybe she really meant that. The enslavement of her people wouldn't have been worth his time. I mean, they already were a conquered people. Though they clearly were not enslaved, because the king had married her. He would not have married a slave. And so maybe in her mind it wouldn't have been so bad. Everyone's still alive even though they've been enslaved. But really the king, I think, is the hardest one to figure out in all this. Like, where is his mind at, right? The Jews are set to be slaughtered, and yet the day before he honored, as he said, Mordecai the Jew. I mean, by name, he called him Mordecai the Jew, and this is the guy that saved my life, and he honored him. And doesn't he know that, all the Jews are going to be slaughtered here, and that he's already given this order, this is going to take place? Why now does he seem to care? In chapter 3, he gave his signet ring to Haman and let him do whatever he wanted to. And Haman made this order that on this day that was coming up in approximately a year, that all the Jews all over the kingdom were to be annihilated. Could it be he didn't actually know what his own order was? That he never bothered to find out, what did Haman actually send out? Who were these people? We saw that with Esther a few chapters ago, that when it first went out, she didn't hear about it there in the palace. She didn't actually know all the details, although all of her kinsmen all over the kingdom were weeping over this. And so maybe he never really bothered to find out what was that order that Haman gave anyways. Any way you look at it, the king's not looking so good here, is he? I mean, not very respectable. Either he's flippant about this order and sort of not putting two and two together that Mordecai, who's this Jewish man who saved my life, is now doomed to die. He doesn't figure that out. He doesn't think it through. Or maybe he, again, doesn't really know what his own order was and doesn't really realize that these are the people that are going to be killed. You would think if you were going to give an order to annihilate a people, you would want to know who those people were before you would do that. But sometimes the powerful in this life think that they can afford to be flippant about weighty matters like this. And so maybe it's not such a surprise that he doesn't really care about the details. I mean, how many employees have gotten an early Christmas present that they were laid off? We see that sort of thing happen to people, and you wonder, how can that happen to people? Now, I know there's business reasons and all that, but still the impact on individuals is, unmistakable. Sometimes the powerful think that there is no reckoning for them because they're not affected by the decisions that they make. But everyone is accountable for the decisions we make, aren't we? I mean, God is the one ultimately who holds us accountable. Even if in this life we're not held accountable, after this life we will be. Hebrews 9:27 tells us that it's appointed to man once to die, but after this the judgment. And so God always makes all the wrongs right in the end. But though Ahasuerus may be flippant about this, he really shows up in this moment, doesn't he? I mean, he protests immediately when he finds out Queen Esther's life is at risk here. He wants to know who's responsible for this. In our minds, I mean, as soon as he asks that question, or really as soon as Esther starts giving her announcement of what's proclaimed against her, you can see him in your mind kind of squirming in his chair, can't you? I mean, just thinking, how can I get out of here without really making a scene? I mean, as soon as this comes up. And then she points the finger at him, and certainly, these words are just terrifying him, as the scripture says. And he can only imagine, you would think, in his mind of how his wife's words that we read from chapter 6 are now being fulfilled before his eyes. That now he's not going to live through this. The king actually has to leave the room because of his anger. You imagine he just wanted to throttle the guy. You've pronounced the death of my wife here. How would someone react to that? And so he's just like, I'm just got to get away from this guy right now. And that's what he does. Now, I've talked about how King Ahasuerus is maybe a little bit flippant, and to this point, that's really benefited Haman. He's taken advantage of that. He was on the cusp of destroying all the Jewish people. And of course, remember, the Jewish people were the historical foe of his people, the Amalekites. In our text today, it's going to list him as an Agagite. It says that Haman is an Agagite, which we talked about that before. It meant that he is of the royal line of the Amalekites, because Agag was the king. And really, in doing this, what Haman was doing is he got this pronouncement made, this edict and all that. He was actually doing the bidding of Satan, wasn't he? He was actually doing the bidding of Satan, because Satan knew then, as he does now, that the Messiah is of the Jews. The one who would be the Savior of the world is of the Jews. The prophecies concerning Jesus that identify this had already been given. You think, for example, of Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 that talks about how the Messiah will sit on the throne of David. So clearly he's of David. That was given about 250 years before this. So these prophecies are out there. So if there's any question in Satan's mind, he knows these are the ones I got to be concerned about. But the king's mood here has turned, and now his mood has turned against Haman. And now God's judgment is going to come now against Haman through the king. Look at verse 8. Esther 7, verse 8. It says, "Now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, 'Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?' As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, 'Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king.' And the king said, 'Hang him on it.' So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided." And so, this king seems a bit prone to his emotions, as we watched him through this book. And finding Haman there on the couch, near his wife, he apparently, Haman was maybe leaning over trying to beg for mercy from her and maybe fell onto the couch, we assume. Well, that's the last straw when he sees that. He's like, okay, now this guy is really going to have it. Right now, here and now, that's it. And one of the eunuchs there is quick to mention Haman's gallows there, this 50 cubit high, which we said is 75 feet. When you think about that in our measurement, that's 75 feet high. It's a huge pole, basically, that he had built. And so this eunuch is quick to point that out. And he even has the inside scoop there, doesn't he? Because Haman never got to say, "I want to hang Mordecai on this," but this eunuch knows that that's what it was for. Somehow he has the inside scoop on it. Maybe he's friends with some of Haman's friends who let him know what was going on. You get the feeling that Haman was not real well liked, right? At least by this eunuch, because he's very quick to say, "Hey, we got this gallows over here," Coincidentally, how convenient. And the king, he jumps at it. He's like, yes, that sounds perfect for him. And so Haman, built this gallows and actually ended up being his gallows instead of for the one he considered an enemy. Proverbs 26 and verse 27 tells us that this is a dynamic that happens sometimes. It says, "He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him." That was Proverbs 26 and 27. And, Proverbs are general words of wisdom. That means that these are things that tend to happen. They don't always happen, but they tend to happen. And this proverb is telling us then that those who plot and scheme, it tends to come back around them is what ends up happening. And that's exactly what happened to Haman here. All his plotting, all his scheming, it actually came down on him instead of the one he wanted. Haman had great confidence before this in his relationship with the king. He saw himself as only moving up and up in, Persian society. But now he finds himself high on a pole he intended for the one he hated. I think Haman is such a lesson of not putting our trust in this world. In Matthew 7, Jesus says that when we live according to what he says, it's like building our house on a rock. One of our songs we worshiped with this morning referenced that. But those who don't build their house on the rock of Jesus, well, invariably then, they're trusting in the world. There's really not another option. They're trusting in the world instead of the Lord. They built their house on sand, Jesus says. They really don't have a foundation. They have nothing stable underneath them. And we know how important foundations are in this part of the country, don't we? Here in central Texas, as we watch as it gets hot in the summer and our houses start doing this. We know how important a solid foundation is under there. But these people had no foundation, so when trouble came, it wiped them out. And that's exactly what happened to Haman here. Haman had what so many in this life seek. He had marriage, he had a family, he had 10 sons. We learned from other sources. He had a good job, he was top man in the kingdom. Only the king was above him. He had wealth as a result of that. But it was all based in this world, right? That's all he had, everything was based in this world. In the end, he was greedy and proud. He was vengeful, even to the point of murder. And now he was dead. Now he was judged for the evil man that he was. Haman found his time of reckoning, but now we're going to see something better. We're going to see a time of redemption here as God's going to raise up Mordecai. So let's look at chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 1. It says, on that day King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, so Esther arose and stood before the king. Then she said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people? And how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they hanged on the gallows, because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. And so as we look at these verses in chapter 8, and these beginning verses, we see first of all that the truth comes out here. Haman's defeat, now that couldn't have been more total. I mean, really when you look at this, his nice home now is given to Queen Esther, which ends up then being Mordecai's. These are some of the Jews he sought to destroy, especially Mordecai, who he just hated so much. But in the midst of this, the truth comes out, and that Esther informs the king who Mordecai really is. You know, he's a blood relative, we know, but he also was her adoptive father. And so she reveals all of that. And, you know, it's so good when the truth is made known, isn't it? I mean, you wonder how Esther maybe struggled with this, keeping that secret all this time. I mean, 5 years they've been married. 5 years she's been married to the king there. We learned that in chapter 3. And all that time, she'd been hiding her ethnicity from him, hiding who her family was. You'd wonder, you never ask, hey, who are your parents? So you never ask anything like that. Of course, her parents actually passed away. Maybe she just said that. But it must have been a tremendous burden that was lifted, you know, to be able to just share that with him. Even though we don't think there would have been any consequences if she had said so ahead of time. But she kept it secret as Mordecai had asked her to. But now the king knows, and that seems to change everything now. Mordecai now takes on Haman's position. The king gives Mordecai his signet ring there. And that means that he can make an order in the name of the king, just like Haman had done before. You know, sometimes believers think that they have to compromise to sort of make it in the world, to have success maybe in their careers and stuff like that. But Mordecai, you know, he ascended to the top here not by following the world's wisdom. He didn't bow to Haman. Remember, that would have been like a politically savvy thing to do. This guy's prime minister, bow to him, you know, make him like you and that sort of thing. He didn't do that. No, instead he did God's will, and that was his way that he ascended to the top, is by following God. Much like Joseph in the book of Genesis, who became prime minister of Egypt. These ascended not by playing the world's game, but by following God's plan for them. And so the question is, I mean, you know, do we believe that today? Do we believe that God has a plan for our lives? Well, I hope we believe that, and that as we follow that plan, we just need to honor Him, and we need to do what's right in His eyes, and He's going to take care of the rest. We need to believe that in the workplace, in our schools, or wherever we're living and working and walking among other people. We need to trust Him in all of our lives, that He's able to guide us, He's able to provide. He is the one who establishes our lives. But though God is sovereign, we're still His boots on the ground, aren't we? We're still His troops in this world, as it were. And so Esther here, she has to plead for her people. There in verse 3, right? Starting in verse 3, she pleads for her people. She wants the king to reverse his decision. You know, send out a note that says, just rescind that previous order. But there's a problem with that in verse 8, maybe you picked up on, that he indicates that basically a decree that he sent out cannot be revoked. You can't revoke an order that's been given by the king. There's not a Supreme Court there in Persia that could declare, oh, that previous ruling was invalid, and so we can't, disregard that, everyone. And there's no real higher authority than him. He is the king in that land. Of course, God is above him, but in his land, he was the king, and there's no one else above him in that land. And so he's decreed it. That's it. That's what's going to happen. Instead, what can be done is to make a new law, to counter the previous one. And notice how the king just sort of gives Mordecai carte blanche here again, right? I mean, he's not really learning much, is he? I mean, Mordecai's a good guy to trust, all right? He's a good guy to trust. But that's what got him in trouble to begin with. So he just gave Haman the signal. He said, do whatever you want. And that's what he's done again here with Mordecai this time, even though this time, again, he's trusting in a good man. And so Mordecai makes this new law. Let's read the rest of our verses here, starting at verse 9. Esther 8, verse 9. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces, which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring and sent letters to couriers on horses riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. In them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in each and every province was published to all the peoples, so that the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, hastened and impelled by the king's command, went out, riding on the royal steeds, and the decree was given out at the citadel in Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor in each and every province and in each and every city, wheresoever the king's commandment went, and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. So Mordecai makes this law, and look at the response of it in verse 15. I mean, people are just like celebrating this, right? They're so happy, and there's Mordecai now dressed in these fine clothing and really looking royal in his dress. This man who in chapter 2 had to sort of peek inside the palace gate to see if Esther was still in there. This man who sat in sackcloth and ashes in chapter 4, weeping before the palace there. Now he's regally dressed and praised for this law and all the good that he's doing. It's really cool to see this transformation. But let's look a little bit at the law here and understand what this law is doing. This law allows the Jews now to defend themselves on that day that was declared others could attack them. Now it says they can defend themselves on that day. Surprisingly, before this point, they would not have been allowed to do that. They could not have defended themselves and organized, sort of a defense against this. Now, would they have held back? We'll never know, right? But that was the law, was they were not allowed to defend themselves. Commentators point out that the previous law really had set, the Persian government on the side of those attacking the Jews, right? I mean, the king gave an order, and so obviously he's saying, this is what's blessed by me, do this. And so even his soldiers would be seen as in favor of this. But with this new order in place, now the government was neutral. The Persian government was out of this whole picture. It says, all right, you enemies, you can attack, and the Jews can, defend themselves against you, but we're not involved with this, right? We're staying out of this. But the law goes a step further, a step that really is at the heart of world debate right now for modern Israel and what's going on in Israel today. That is that they can not only defend themselves according to this law, but then they can attack, plunder, and take the spoil. Right? It's not just a matter of defending yourself and holding your own ground. They can go forward then. You've heard that expression, if you wake the bull, you get the horns. That's what this law is saying. Basically, you go against the Jewish people, they're going to come back at you, and they have full rights to do that. If the enemy starts the fight. The Jews aren't to go on a rampage here, but once they bring it to the Jewish people's own yard, as it were, they can take it right back into their neighbor's yard, is what it's saying. Arguably, that's the only way they could really win, isn't it? I mean, on that day. I mean, if they just merely defended their own property, so to speak, their enemies, having revealed who they are, they might stop fighting them once the Jews give a resistance, but then they can sort of regroup and replan and attack again, And so in order for them to actually have peace and be safe there as the Jewish people, they had to be able to really conquer the ones who invaded them and were attacking them. And so it's amazing how this parallels what's going on right now in our world. It just repeats itself over and over for God's people. Laws are to be a deterrent against evil. And Romans 13:4 says that the government does not bear the sword for nothing, right? So that punishment can be given where crime has been committed and so forth. And when laws are weak on punishing evil, evil flourishes. And we see that today too. I mean, that's something else that parallels to what's going on in our world today. As cities and states like California in particular have decided not to really prosecute certain crimes, like shoplifting and things like that, we see that crime just runs amok then, right? And all these stores that used to be in, for example, downtown San Francisco, these high-end stores, people would come there to go there and go to these nice stores like Old Navy and Nordstrom's and stuff like that. They're closing, because there's too much thievery going on. The thieves are thriving and the stores are dying, basically. Closer to where I grew up, even up in Chicago, they're having things like that. You've heard of the Magnificent Mile and has all these incredible stores. I remember going there before as when I was in school and stuff, and now it's like, everything's closing down there. It's hard to imagine, that's what's happening, but it's just crime running amok. But Mordecai's law here is strong, isn't it? It's not a weak law. It's a very strong law. And it results not only in joy for the Jews we saw, but did you pick up in verse 17 that others were converting to the Jewish faith as a result of this law? They're so afraid of what the Jews might do. They're like, okay, I'm just going to get on this camp now, and I'm going to become Jewish myself. I don't know if that's a great evangelism tool there to do that, but that's what was happening, So, but how incredible is it? God has provoked the fear of His people into the Persians, which, when you think of it, the Jews were a minority, right? And so it's just amazing how God stoked that fear. How else could it be that this small amount of people would bring such fear in this massive people around them? But this is always the way, really. When God says a people or work He wants to bless that, He's going to bless it, right? He's going to work there. No matter how weak or small it may seem, God can do it. We're reminded of that in Romans 8, verse 31. Picking up in the middle of the verse, Romans 8:31 says, if God is for us, who is against us? And as we go through times of testing individually and even as a church, and I think we are experiencing some testing as we're getting ready to move into a new location, the enemy wants to disrupt those things in our lives. But we know that Romans 8:31 is true for us today too. Right? If God is for us, who is against us? In the end, God's plans are what will stand, and that's really what we want. And so in the book of Esther here, the stage is set. Both sides are preparing for this day of conflict. We'll look at that next time that we come together. In our lives and ministry, there's also conflict. We have conflict with our spiritual enemy, right? We battle not against flesh and blood, the Bible tells us. But just as God is certainly delivering the Jews through Esther, and He's going to lead them to victory, so we look to God to lead us to victory in our lives as a church body and as individuals in the battles we face. Now, it would be dishonest to say in this life we always win as Christians, right? We don't always win, right? Clearly, we don't always win in this life. But as believers, we can never truly lose at the same time, even in setbacks. We know what Romans 8:28 tells us. In Romans 8:28, it says, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. And so even as believers, when we appear to lose in this life, in the end, we're still going to win, because God is working for our good. Let's close in prayer. Thank you, God, for that truth, that you are always working for our good, Lord. Your loving kindness is there. Your guiding hand is there. Thank you, Lord, that we can trust you, even when maybe don't like what we see going on around us, that we can trust that you're going to work in that situation. You are working, and you're going to bring good in our lives in some way through that. Lord, help us to believe that and to walk in that, Lord, as we go through this week and just through our lives. And we praise you for the awesome God that you are. We don't deserve these things. In Jesus' name.